In April of 1970, America watched and waited as the three Apollo 13 astronauts, having lost their chance to walk on the moon, desperately tried to get home alive. Would they have enough oxygen? Did they have enough battery power? Would they be overcome by poison gas before even returning to the Earth's atmosphere? Director Ron Howard has made a movie about this dramatic and true adventure. Known for his work with ensemble cast in Cocoon, Parenthood, Backdraft, and The Paper, Ron Howard brings together another extraordinary group of actors led by Tom Hanks as Jim Lovell. Apollo 13 also stars Ed Harris, Gary Sinise, Kevin Bacon, and Kathleen Quinlan. I'm pleased to have Ron Howard back on this broadcast to talk about this movie, Apollo 13, which opens around the country soon. Welcome.
Thank you.
This was extraordinary footage we saw here, and you said to me as we were watching it, Buzz Aldrin said to you what?
Oh, well, we had a screening for a number of the astronauts, and Buzz Aldrin came up to me afterward and he said, "Did you find some vault, some footage in a vault somewhere that nobody knew about? That's incredible footage of a launch. Which launch was that?" Yeah. And I said, "Well, that was our launch. We generated that one ourselves." And he said, he was great. He said, "Can we borrow it?"
Point is that you'd used no footage from the actual launches and from whatever you might have had of Apollo 13 in any of.
We looked at all of it. We looked at all of it. We did dig up some new stuff, as a matter of fact. Film editors Dan Hanley and Mike Hill actually went to Huntsville, Alabama, and dug through the archives there. But in the end, I wanted to be able to put the camera in places that would help create a new kind of experience for the audience, a new way of looking at one of these launches.
Why did this story attract you, and when did you first think about this?
Well, we got word, when I say we, I'm including my partner Brian Grazer at Imagine Films, that there was a 10-page book proposal floating around, and that in fact Jim Lovell and Jeffrey Kluger, the guy who wrote the book with Jim Lovell, had made a publishing deal, and they were shopping it to Hollywood. A guy who works at our company, a guy named Michael Bostic, he's a script reader and development guy. His father, Jerry Bostic, was a mission controller. He got hold of this 10 pages, and he said, "Now look, this is pretty exciting, obviously, but there's far more here than even the 10 pages indicate." And we started bidding on it, and we won. We won a kind of classic Hollywood bidding war that night. But it was a totally unique kind of adventure story. And it was thrilling, I felt. It was suspenseful. It was emotional, and it happened to be true.
Where were you when it happened? You were 16 years old.
I was 16. You know, for the longest time, I couldn't figure out why I didn't really remember in any kind of detail this mission, because I did care about the space program and followed a bit as a teenager. And then I realized that I was off in the desert acting in a one-time guest shot on Gunsmoke. And there were no TVs in the motel where we were filming, and so I remember hearing there was an explosion, hearing about the crisis, but I did not get to follow it. The more I learned about the mission in detail, the kind of unraveling that they experienced after the explosion in space, well, the more I realized that in fact this was an incredible, kind of an amazing story, a story that is so amazing that if you made up a lot of this stuff, you'd get booed right out of the theater. But the fact that it's true, you get to make no apologies.
How long was it in development?
Well, it went pretty quickly, but I think it was about a year and a half in development.
Hanks was your first choice?
Yeah, well, quite frankly, it all came together so quickly, I'm not sure there were ever other choices or other serious discussions. Kevin Costner's company had bid on the material as well, and so the studio was kind of intrigued by that possibility. But Tom Hanks's agent, a fellow named Richard Lovett, told us that when he heard of the script that Tom had always wanted to play an astronaut and had in fact even said a couple of years before, "Gee, there's a mission, Apollo 13. It's very dramatic. I can't imagine why anyone hasn't done a movie of it." And so here a couple of years later we actually had a script of it. So his good agenting gave Tom the script almost at the same time I was reading it, and the whole thing came together very quickly.
How did you prepare for it to do the film?
Well,
I mean, because you're dealing with a real story,
Yeah.
with people that you could talk to.
Yeah, it was
with
daunting.
footage, with all the reality, and you had the mission to be as authentic as you possibly could.
Right. Well, in a way, that wasn't the mission in the beginning. You know, I'm a storyteller. I'm a Hollywood filmmaker.
Yeah.
And first and foremost, it was, well, how do I make this story as entertaining and exciting as possible? And I thought, well, if I have to bend things here and there, okay.
You'll take some dramatic license.
People do it all the time. But Hanks, to his credit, kept saying, you know, you don't know everything about this story. Wait till you really find out about this thing. And we kept digging deeper and deeper into it. And as I began meeting the astronauts, beginning, of course, with Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, Jack Swigert, regrettably, is deceased, Ken Mattingly, who dramatically was removed from the mission just a couple of days before he was supposed to go.
Because he'd been exposed to somebody that had measles.
That's right. And most importantly, and significantly, the mission controllers. When I began to see the look in their eye as they talked about this mission 25 years later, I understood it in much more human and dramatic terms. The emotional investment in this rescue was far more meaningful, impactful, and dramatic than I ever realized. And I personally, my own perspective on the whole thing began to shift. And authenticity became of primary importance to me because I realized that, in fact, you know, the truth in this story was far better than anything we could ever cook up, and it was a thrilling story.
Yeah. Before we go further, I'll make a couple points. One, you had Hanks and others go through weightlessness.
Yeah, I did too.
And you did too.
I
You
did
went
too.
up on a plane they have, what they call it, the vomit comet.
They call it the vomit comet, yeah, NASA.
You had Ed Harris, who plays the flight controller, who's
Gene
in
Kranz.
charge of Gene Kranz. You had him go to flight controller school or something.
Yeah.
And some of the other people who played those parts
Space
to
Camp
create a
and things like
sense
that.
of the language of the...
Yes, well, we did. I mean, first of all, the research was fascinating. A little bit of a chore for me. I'm not a terribly scientifically minded person, you know. But again, the more we learned about it, the better the story. The more we learned about the people, the more dramatic. The details were there, but you had to dig for them a little bit. And the actors were fantastic. I mean, they became real collaborators in the process. They had constantly had their noses in the actual transcripts, listening to the flight tapes and coming up with great lines of dialogue that would either humanize it or make it more exciting or even add humor at times. And Tom Hanks was leading the charge all the way. I mean, he never tired of going and looking at a documentary, of reading more about it, coming up with somebody's an article that somebody had found. And he sort of helped stimulate this environment.
What was Jim Lovell's involvement?
Well, of course, you know, we had the book.
It's called Lost Moon?
Yes. Although it's coming out in paperback now, and I think they're calling it Apollo 13 for the paperback.
Imagine why.
But and it has a big picture of Tom Hanks on the cover. But it's a great book. It really is. But
His involvement in the film.
Hank spent 3 or 4 days with Jim Lovell. And on a separate occasion, as a matter of fact, Kathleen Quinlan, who plays Marilyn Lovell, spent 3 or 4 days there with the Lovells as well. Jim spent a lot of time with us in pre-production. We'd had a couple of all-day sessions where we went into our mock-ups of the capsules, and Jim Lovell talked us through, you know, the entire mission, pointing to switches that he'd be hitting, dials, talking about reactions that the other fellows had had. Bill Paxton, who plays Fred Haise, had a chance to meet with Fred Haise, as I did. And it was, you know, there was a lot of detail work there. When it came to the filming, not only was Jim out on a book tour and not really available to us on a day-to-day basis, but I felt it would be a little intimidating. And I told Jim privately, you know, that to actually have the real Jim Lovell here every minute was going to be daunting. And he suggested the commander of Apollo 15, great guy, Dave Scott. He happened to live in Southern California. And I thought he'd come in a few hours here and there, and he became so important and so critical to us that it wound up becoming kind of a full-time job to him.
Before we get too far along, tell me the story. What, in fact, happened to Apollo 13?
Well, they took off. It was the 13th Apollo mission. They took off at 13:13. And everybody made great jokes about this. And then on April 13th, they took off on the 11th. On April 13th, they had this explosion in space. No one really knew why, exactly what had happened at the time, but they soon quickly realized that they were losing oxygen, which not only was a problem in terms of their breathing, but oxygen is critical to their power supply. Batteries started going. And the whole thing just began to disintegrate. And suddenly, not only did Jim Lovell and company lose their dream of walking on the moon, but it was replaced by this far more serious challenge, and a more difficult challenge, getting home. And many of the procedures that they had to try to execute had never really been simulated before, despite all the redundancy that they try to build into all those missions. They had to, as Ed Harris says in the movie, playing Gene Kranz, throw out the flight plan.
Yeah, we got to start all over here. We've never seen anything like this.
Yeah.
This is the moment in which they know they've got a problem in the clip. The actual language was, "We had a problem."
Right.
You have your actor say, "We have Houston, we have a problem."
Right.
Roll tape. Here it is. So there it is. Now they've got to figure out how, not only they're not going to go to the moon, they may not be able to make it back unless everything works. If there's any mistake, it's all over.
What was fascinating to me, but a little hard to grasp at first, because as I said, I don't really understand the physics of space. Certainly, I didn't going into the project, but it wasn't just this explosion. Things continued to get worse, and they were constantly facing a new crisis, and the more I could begin to understand, what it actually meant to the flight, what it meant to the astronauts, I was able to find ways to communicate it to you and me and the other people who needed to understand it in order to understand the jeopardy and the suspense.
Where's the poetry in this story?
Yeah, I think it lies in a couple of areas, but first and foremost, it is in this story of Jim Lovell. I mean, this was his fourth mission into space. He was on the crew that first, Apollo 8, that first left Earth's orbit and traveled to the moon, orbited 10 times, came back safely. It was a huge breakthrough. And now it was his turn to walk on the moon.
At this time, he had more hours in space than any other astronaut alive.
That's right. I mean, he was as prepared as anyone to make this journey, and it was his life's work.
Yeah.
And to see that taken away, but then to realize that he had to use every ounce of his training and all of his emotional and mental and physical endurance to rise to a far greater challenge and try to guide this thing home with, of course, the help of Mission Control. That there's something there's bittersweet there, but great poetry in that. Also, in the teamwork, they don't talk a lot about what they're doing. They try to keep their emotions in check, but those emotions are there, and you begin to see the process that NASA had developed, the problem-solving process, played out in sort of minutes and hours instead of days, months, and weeks.
Because people will ask, how, when you're doing something that's so much about technology and about humans using technology to get to the moon, to get back, to fix problems, to use computers, how do you bring in the human dynamic to that kind of story where you can be overwhelmed by the machinery?
Well, in the beginning, I sort of thought it was all about the technology. And, oh, this is cool. I'm going to do a lot of great shots of spaceships.
I get to be Stanley Kubrick and all that.
Right. But or attempt, follow in that shadow, But as I began to meet the people and see what it was they went through, well, to me, that sort of became the story. And that, I felt, was going to be the source of the suspense. It wasn't going to be, did they make it, did they not make it?
We knew that.
It was going to be, can you imagine going through that? We had no idea this is what they endured.
Yeah. And how enormous an obstacle they had to overcome to get them back there. And they did it only through, in the end, human wit.
Yes.
All right. Roll tape. This is Ed Harris in a wonderful performance making the point about what's at stake here. Here it is. All right.
That line, that failure is not an option. I heard Gene Kranz say that in a group meeting.
He's playing Gene Kranz, right? The flight controller.
Yes, yeah. It was amazing. We had this reunion of 14 or 15 of the flight crew, the mission controllers, and it was actually in the mission control room where all this happened, and a lot of them hadn't really seen each other.
Did you fear at all in making this? The Right Stuff came to us with much
fanfare. Yeah.
And did not go as
right.
expected.
Yeah.
For reasons nobody quite knows, and you
Everybody's
may know.
got a theory, but who knows? Whoever
Did you
knows.
fear that maybe an American movie audience or a worldwide movie audience is just simply not interested in this kind of story?
Sure. Brian and I talked a lot about that. But this one seemed different. This is one of those true stories that naturally carries with it sort of a classic structure. I mean, it has that beginning, middle, and end. It has a drive. And we felt that the suspense of the story would make it exciting enough that you could explain to people why this was going to be entertaining.
There is a moment in the capsule in which two of the astronauts, not Lovell, are at each other's throat.
Right.
Because they don't really know why this thing went out of control, why they had this explosion. And there's a suspicion, because the character played by Kevin Bacon, Jack Swigert, who's a great pilot who ran for Congress, was elected, but never got to serve because he died of cancer before he came to Washington, as I remember.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think you say this in the postmortem. They are at each other's throats. They didn't like each other. Anyway, because Swigert had came on the flight at the last day. Roll tape. This shows you that even in these tense moments, there's this sense of, why are we in this trouble? Here it is. What they meant by that is that they could hear him in Houston having this fight.
That's why he wanted to make sure that they couldn't hear him on the fight, so that he could put his cool astronaut voice into place.
Is there any dramatic license here?
Yeah, this is a dramatic impression of this mission. I realized early on we were not going to be able to include everything, and we were going to have to take some dramatic license in some places. Jack Swigert, who is not around to make his case, according to Jim Lovell, was very concerned about reentry data and the fact that he feared that in some ways that Houston may have miscalculated and might not know how to get them into a reentry program that would deliver them alive. None of them would ever admit to any kind of a spat, but when you would ask them about it, was there ever any tension, you'd get this sort of long pause, and Tom Hanks and the actors and I decided, well, look, clearly there were some tensions. Whether they were able to hold them in check entirely, they will never tell us, but we know what they were feeling. Let's go ahead and make a scene out of it.
Yeah. What was the worst moment for Lovell when you talked to him about this thing?
Well, I think there were two.
The fear of the reentry, I assume.
Well, it was really the first moment when he realized he wasn't going to get to go on the moon.
Yeah.
Because that was a devastating blow. And then there was another moment. He'd been kind of moping about it himself, and there was another moment when he realized that it was going to take a lot of mental sort of endurance. It was going to be a real test if they were going to make it back. And he sort of pulled the crew together, and he sort of made this little speech to them, gentlemen, what are your intentions? And he felt that if they really didn't pull together, there was a real risk they might not make it. And that was the one time he kind of admitted that he had some doubts.
What do you have at stake here in this film? $54 million or somewhere thereabouts. It's a big budget film for you.
Yeah.
You have a record and reputation for being a commercially successful filmmaker.
Well, every time you make a film, it's a big responsibility. It's a responsibility to the investors, who in this case feel very good about what the movie costs, because it's not unusual nowadays for adventure films to go over $100 million in cost. So, while 50 million plus certainly sounds like a heck of a lot of money, and is, they felt it was a fairly efficient production. But we got a great story, a story that, let's set aside the commercial aspects of it. We really did want to honor the story and tell it with integrity. And I think that's what people did when they came to work every day. That's what the actors felt. I want the movie to be commercial. I want as many people to see it as possible. I've got a number of actors who are, experiencing real career bursts. Things are going very well for Tom Hanks, Gary Sinise, Kevin Bacon, Bill Paxton, Ed Harris. They trust me when they come onto a movie. They trust me to make them look good. They trust me to put them in a film that audiences are going to appreciate.
Trust you to make them look good, meaning what?
to create an environment where they're going to be able to do their best work, and that's what I try to give them. All the actors have seen the film, and I'm thrilled that they're proud to be in this movie. Now we want it to go out there and hopefully generate some attention and get people to go see it.
In the end, this is about what? I mean, it's about all the things that we talk about, but is it also about something that's special in the American psyche, something that is special about how we feel about ourselves, something about, as Ed Harris said here, failure is not an option?
I think it is about pulling together. I think it is also about intellect kind of carrying the day. These are heroes that don't sort of make it with guns and fistfights. They don't make it on sort of on sheer courage. Certainly these are very courageous people. But you know why they really made it? They really made it because they'd prepared to the nth degree, and they threw an enormous amount of brain power into this thing, and that's what carried the day. That's what carried the day. A kind of a commitment to an idea, not some sort of John Wayne rah-rah kind of a thing.
You also got the impression that these astronauts in your film and reflecting the lives of the actual astronauts were not cowboys as much as they were people who knew their job and who understood, as you say, from an intellectual standpoint, understood how to make things work.
Yeah.
And by understanding how to make it work, they understood how to fix it when it got in trouble.
Particularly by the time you got to the Apollo era.
Yeah.
They were all test pilots. They were all comfortable with the idea that something could happen. They could get killed doing this. They passed that years before. But they were rocket scientists. They were engineers. They were curious about the moon, as well as wanting the rush of the ride.
How much cooperation did you get from NASA?
Well, we got tremendous cooperation. We actually didn't have to ask for that much. We filmed at Cape Canaveral, the huge crawler that carries, still to this day, carries the spacecraft out to the launch pad. We utilized that, and they after a long period of discussion, they allowed us to use the NASA simulator, which is not a room, the weightless simulator. It's not a room where you open the door, go inside, and you start floating. It's an aircraft called the KC-135. Right. And it was a huge breakthrough for me as a filmmaker to gain the opportunity to do this. No film production crew has ever filmed under those conditions. And in terms of really offering the audience, somebody in the audience, a realistic sense of what the journey was like, it was imperative. We never could have faked it the way and given the audience something as authentic as this.
The interesting thing about this mission, too, and the reason we're taking time to go through this is because of American history. I mean, it is a dramatic story, and it is part of American history. But the interesting thing as well is that America in April 1970 had grown blasé about Apollo, about going to the moon, about space flights. Witness this clip, which shows you, I think, a broadcast by Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks, that the networks had access to but didn't carry. Here it is. A little bit more about casting.
Right.
Jim Lovell's mother
Yes.
is played by your mother,
Jean
who is a
Spiegel Howard.
former actress.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah. And well, she's been acting recently, over the past few years, and doing some sitcoms. She's kind of the new little old lady on the sitcom block.
She's terrific in this.
Thank you. I'm very proud of her. I was very nervous about casting her in it.
Did she have to audition for this?
Well, in fact, she did.
Yes.
Well, it was a very important role, albeit small, but
Yeah, it was.
this is an important movie to everybody, and I don't take casting lightly. I love to work with my family and friends when I can, but it's never you could play this part. It's too important for that.
Yeah. John Travolta on this program.
Right. I heard about this.
Desperately wanted to play because he loved flying.
Right. He's a
flies
pilot.
his own plane, his own jet, and is very good, I'm told.
Oh yeah, had an emergency landing.
Landing at Dulles.
Yeah.
Wanted to play. I guess the Ed Harris part was that. Which one did he want?
He wanted to be in this movie. He wanted to be an astronaut.
Why couldn't you find room for John Travolta, for goodness' sake?
Well, I didn't. I mean, John Travolta's a huge star. I didn't want to put him in some little cameo, where he would distract from the reality and the flow of the movie. And in trying to put together my group, you know, you take a lot of things into account, and look, it's very tempting. I've always wanted to work with John Travolta. You know, I think he's a great actor, and he had a little slump there for a little while. Never bothered me. I was always looking for a chance to get John Travolta in a movie. But you know, when I looked at the team, I felt that Tom Hanks, Kevin Bacon, and Bill Paxton just felt, you know, right, and I didn't see how to fit John in there. And you know, one of these days,
Did you have a personal conversation about it, or would you just fax him a rejection?
No, we talked about it, and John knows how much I want to work with him. So you know, I mean, it was a friendly kind of a thing. But a lot of actors wanted to be in this movie. It was just.
Who else did you turn down?
Well, I don't want to go. if they admit it, that's one thing. But you know, people were fascinated by the story, and it was an opportunity to be a part of a very unique kind of film.
You cast Hanks before you'd seen Forrest Gump.
Oh yeah. I you know, he had just, I think, been nominated for Philadelphia, but no one knew whether he was going to win for that movie or not. And yeah, hadn't seen Forrest Gump yet. So at that moment, it was you know, a slightly surprising choice for some people. I had people actually come up to me and say, "Wait a minute, are you doing like a comedy version?" Yeah. But you know, they had not yet seen Philadelphia and Forrest Gump, and Brian and I were doing, you know,
Why
backflips.
did you want Hanks?
Well, for his intelligence, his humanity, and his integrity as an actor. I knew, especially after having one conversation with him, that he knew a lot about the space program, and his passion and talent. I mean, I wanted to make it a collaboration. When I saw how he felt about this story and playing an astronaut, I didn't want to just hire somebody to come in and play the role of Jim Lovell. I wanted Tom Hanks, and I wanted to work very closely with him on making this movie.
I'm saying this right, I hope. His co-star in Forrest Gump, Gary Sinise.
Yeah.
Why him?
Tom recommended him. Gary Sinise is one of these guys that I've interviewed a couple of times, always admired his work. He's also a terrific film and stage director. And he's just one of 80 guys who came in and auditioned for the part of Ken Mattingly and knocked me out with his audition and got the job.
Kevin Bacon had to audition as well?
No, I've seen a lot of Kevin Bacon's work, and we came in and we had a conversation and talked about it, and then another follow-up talk on the phone, and I cast Kevin based on those conversations.
Roll tape. This is Gary Sinise. Are the Flowers Blooming? This is a conversation in which Mattingly, who had to drop out, and he was replaced by Jack Swigert, played by Kevin Bacon, doesn't get to see his dream, which is to go to the moon, but he plays a crucial role in the rescue in real life.
And the flight surgeon had said that he was going to get the measles, which he didn't think he would get.
Because he'd been exposed to it, but they couldn't risk it, and that was a decision made by Lovell.
That's right.
Not to have him.
This little scene is right out of the transcript, too.
Say that again?
A short would have meant a fire inside that capsule. But, you know, you couldn't... There you have the guy who got sort of left at the altar, you know, Ken Mattingly, and with no sort of direct bitterness toward Jack Swigert, but certainly a lot of envy. There's the guy who replaced him, and you couldn't have written this any better. I mean, here at a crucial moment, who's the guy who's literally feeding them the sort of the life-giving information?
He goes into simulation so that he can decide what series of processes they have to go through to get them back.
Because he knows the command module as well or better than anyone. And
you shot this in sequence.
As much as we possibly could, we did. And, you know, we shot all the capsule stuff in sequence, all the mission control stuff in sequence, and the stuff at home in sequence. I did it for a couple of reasons. One, I learned a lesson from George Lucas, who, you know, directed Star Wars, but also directed a movie I acted in, American Graffiti. And that was all supposed to take place in one night. And he shot